Right. Well, here we are. Now I just need to go and figure out how to make my myself visible. Okay, here we go. So for those of you in the United States, it is not yet 4th of July. Where I'm at, it is. I was just thinking about what is it that freedom actually means? What is it that freedom means? How much freedom is freedom? Do you need limitations to freedom? Should people have the freedom to do things that could get themselves killed? What principles should dictate how much freedom people should have, how much freedom people do have, and so on? How do we talk about freedom? There's a lot to be said on the subject matter. Kind of difficult, isn't it? Kind of difficult, isn't it? Well, on that particular note, I think that it would be good of us, be very good of us to read through the Declaration of Independence, especially given the time of year. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are by which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. It is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly, for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices, and the amount in payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices, and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishments for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefit of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They, too, have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must, therefore, acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So good evening, good morning, good afternoon, good day to all of you. So, on July 4th, 1776, that document was signed. How far we've come. How far we have come. How far the world has gone in so many directions since then. Over the span of a few decades, the colonies, having been established in freedom, managed to transform the United States into a superpower that rivaled Britain, rivaled France, so on. And there's something about the USA that I think is interesting. Because even now, I notice, and I would say this is especially true in the Midwest, but all throughout the United States, I notice that there are preponderance of people, or there is a preponderance of people with very different attitudes than are here in Europe. Very different attitudes indeed. People in the United States value their autonomy. I'm not saying everyone does, but I'm saying that categorically I would say that people in the United States love freedom more than people anywhere else. The number of people who love freedom in the United States is growing. But I would say that the percentage is considerably lower now than it was back in the early 1800s. Now I'd say that people don't even know what freedom is. People haven't explored the difficult topics associated with freedom. People haven't read the classics. People haven't read philosophy. People haven't thought these things through to any appreciable extent. And I think that that does many people a disservice. Because if you write, for instance, a Constitution, the way the U.S. Constitution was written, it was written based upon the supposition that there was a particular set of morals. There was a particular understanding that everyone had, or at least a particular set of values that everyone had. And if you don't have the particular set of values, your freedom's going to go down the toilet. So paradoxically, let's start with, and I'm going to go with Locke instead of the founding fathers, because there was fighting over pursuit of happiness versus property, and I would say life, liberty, and property are basically a statement of self-ownership. So this idea that I own myself and you own yourself, which, let's say that there are people of a particular religion that said, well, okay, I don't own myself, God owns me. Well, then I suppose that gives God the right to erect a dictator and hold the dictator to different standards than you. And especially in the Constantinian model, especially in the model where the state and the church are very close, and that definitely took place in the Roman Empire, and to a great extent still takes place up in Scandinavia, where you wind up having a very strong faith-state connection. Although nominally it's not like, any more that there's a national religion, although it may very well be, or might as well be. But if you're dealing with this whole, the ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if you're dealing with these as rights, what does this actually mean? I would say that is the definition of self-ownership. So at least in a civic sense, if you believe that there's a particular way that people should be treated, if you believe that there's a particular way people should be treated, you can't get past this idea of at least civic self-ownership. In religious environments, you can go and talk about God made me and I'm just a steward of my body, or God made me in this and God made me in that, and so on, and that's perfectly fine. And one might even say in religious circles, well, okay, we don't care about minimizing suffering. We don't care about maximizing productivity. Heaven is my home, and that's it. But at the same time, it's quite interesting, because if we go and we read here we are. So there's a general pattern that I've understood. Unfortunately, I'm having a little bit of trouble pulling up the Bible. I know it's in Jeremiah chapter 29. And I would say this to Christians who would say that the civic right to self-ownership shouldn't be a big thing, or shouldn't be a thing at all. And this is in a historical context of Israel having been exiled into Babylon before they were allowed to go back. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon: build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare you will find your welfare. For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, do not let your prophets and your diviners who are among you deceive you, and do not listen to the dreams that they dream, for it is a lie that they're prophesying to you in my name. I did not send them, declares the Lord. So seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. And at least with the understanding, a Christian understanding of the land and a Christian understanding of exile, as long as people aren't in heaven, we are not home, we are in exile in this particular world. We're just passing through. And so we are to seek the good of the city that we're in. And if we understand that civil society is predicated upon the right to life, liberty, and property, it all comes together. Now, life would mean that we have the right to our body, and I would include our what we are right here, right now, our present. And if somebody goes and takes that away, we call that murder. I can no longer enjoy my life. And however many years I would have had, I will not be able to enjoy that. Taking life steals my future from me. Liberty. How am I supposed to, if self-ownership is a thing, well then other ownership is not. So whereas there's still hope for the future, nobody's killed me yet, there's still slavery. So self-ownership is not only against murder, but it's against slavery. And then if we believe in a right to property, that would then be saying, okay, well, the things that I've done in the past, the things that I have earned, the things that I have built, the things that I have that are mine, I have a right to them. And if somebody takes my property, the word for that would be theft. And another word for another way that people might go about it would be fraud. Fraud. So theft and fraud are taking away your property, the fruits of your past labors, to which I would argue you have a right. An unalienable right at that. And to the extent that people don't believe that these rights are unalienable, we run into many problems. We run into many, many problems. I'm going to take a check at Twitch chat, see if anybody's saying anything. No one has said anything yet, at least not according to my chat. Now, going back to this whole idea of freedom. The idea that somebody else should be able to dictate what goes on in my life, or what goes on in your life, is antithetical to freedom. And if we go by the principles of Hegelian dialectic, where we have a thesis, and we have an antithesis, and we try to synthesize them together, what would that synthesis look like? Is that even a fair method of argumentation and discourse? Does that even work here? I'd say not, because we're actually dealing with axiomatic systems. We're dealing with axiomatic systems here. And if you take the right to life, liberty, and property as an axiom, or as three different axioms, or three different pillars of the same axiom, there are some other axioms that are incompatible therewith. There are some things that there are some things for which we just can't stand. And while our standard of living as human beings, as humanity, has gone up drastically in the past couple centuries, mostly due to following this particular set of ideals, mostly due to the increase in freedom and the prosperity which free markets bring, and largely with a great deal of thanks to, and I'm going to say, our cultural neighbors across the pond. English common law was a good thing. English common law was a very good thing. There's been a great deal of prosperity, but as prosperity has increased, so has people's complacence. And people's complacence is gone and put it to a point where you could have almost an entire populace being able to articulate this whole basic idea of life, liberty, and property in an effective, cogent, coherent manner, to having people staring at an iPhone all day, to having people listening to their music and consuming at every turn and trying not to produce anything, living off of what other people have made. And the fact that there exists so much that it's possible to do that, that's a very good thing, I would say. But the fact that people are content with that is very bad. So, what were these limits of life, liberty, and property? What are the limits of mine? I mean, like, if I wanted to go acquire more property and have it be mine, the limit would be, okay, I can do with myself what I want to, as long as I don't go and infringe upon the life, liberty, and property of others, right? I can swing my arms around all day, but when my arm contacts your nose, well, I'm making your life a little more difficult, aren't I? I'm not murdering you, but I'm causing you bodily harm. I'm causing you bodily harm, which is somewhere on the spectrum of taking your life. It may be a very minor thing. I may break your nose. I may shatter your skull if I hit just the wrong place at the wrong angle. So I don't have a right to wave my fist wherever. I don't have a right to wave my fist wherever. I only have a right to wave my fist in a place where I'm not aggressively taking away your rights. I would also say I have a right to wave my fist in your face if you're trying to deprive me of my rights. So these very basic ideas of what it is we can and cannot do, and having the hard imposition that we have freedom as long as we don't impinge upon the freedom of others, winds up maximizing the amount of freedom that we all have, as well as maximizing the quality of life that we all have and the amount of property that we all can obtain. This reminds me of a discussion that we had a couple streams ago while reading Economics in the Free Markets about the Tongass National Forest logging projects versus whatever the piece of land owned by the Audubon Society that has drilling, and what having the right to your own stuff does, and how it can cause you to be a good steward of what it is that you have. So not only from a moral perspective, but also from a practical perspective, from a utilitarian perspective, one can argue that the existence of fundamental human rights is a good thing. And how interesting it is that people further and further removed from the consent of the governed are making decisions that take away the governed's right to life, liberty, and property. Well, however that happens, it's not good. But to some extent I can say that if people lose their freedom, or at least collectively if people lose their freedom, if in a democratic republic people lose their freedom, it's entirely due to the fact that they don't want it. And why wouldn't people want it? Well, because they've gotten used to things that government has provided them. And if the costs are spread collectively, it's very difficult for people to notice and to deal with individual bits of waste. And if people, oh, well, a little theft isn't bad, a little taxation isn't bad. You know, I'm even okay, right, with using the power of the government to steal from the people in order for to establish national defense. I'm okay with that. Because I would be okay with using the strong arm of the government or myself compelling, if there's an enemy knocking on our doorsteps, quite literally on our doorsteps, and having everybody in my house, from the youngest to the oldest, I would be all right with compelling them to fight. I would be all right with compelling them to fight. And so, because not everyone can fight, and because the economic machine needs to keep oiled and keep going, I mean, obviously, compelling people to be able to fight on behalf of their country is also the, you know, part of the duty of people is to pay taxes to do that. And until a better method actually exists, or at least even the hope of trying a better method, the hope of saying, okay, well, we can start a private army and see how that works, which I believe would actually work quite nicely. Until that winds up becoming a feasible alternative, I'm going to be okay with the idea of of the state having an army. But ultimately, that is beholden to the taxpayer. Ultimately, that's beholden to the taxpayer. And certainly can't rule over the taxpayer. With limited rights as to where they can go and what they can do. people will say, okay, well, not infringing upon the life, liberty, and property of others allows them to be hateful. To which I'll say yes. It allows them to be hateful, but it doesn't allow them to be hateful past a certain point. And the point that the governments have exceeded for a great deal of time now, that respect for the individual rights of others would allow people to be hateful, would be a far lesser evil than that of disconnected government arbiters coming and mandating things of the constituents of the districts over which they rule. Heck, democracy has turned into a farce. Democracy is a farce. If no other reason than the fact that the rights of the individual have lost meaning. The rights of the individual have lost meaning. People don't believe, or at least they'll pay lip service to the right to life, liberty, and property, but then when push comes to shove, they'll give those rights up and force others to do the same. To the point where the only abomination worse than what governments all over the developed world subject their citizens to would be quartering. Quartering. The taxes are higher now. The government reach is higher now. The state has become, especially the administrative state, has become bloated. Which leads to another small discussion involving the fact that I think that open borders are a good thing, and I think that welfare is a bad thing. I think that making the immigration process as easy as possible is good. But you cannot have open borders in a welfare state. You cannot have both. If you have a nanny state, if you have a welfare state, if you have a state that believes on taxing the rich more and more and more and more and more and more and more, to artificially cause there to be poor, and then constantly give more and more to more and more poor and have less and less people actually doing something, well, that's bad. That's very, 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 very bad. Indeed, I would go and say I've already written a little piece on a similar subject here. And if I can find it, I'll And here we are, why don't conservatives vote to help the poor like Christ and God demand, and how liberals try to do all the time. And yes, please do bear with me because this is relevant. I answer, well, if by conservatives you mean Christian conservatives, and if by help the poor you mean vote for politicians who promise to help poor people by sending more government money in their direction, I think I have just the answer for you. Particularly in the present-day Western world, where it might be difficult for those without a background in economics to understand the ramifications of compelled versus voluntary giving, I can understand how it's possible to come to the conclusion that the only kind of people that can possibly vote against the poor, meaning against policies that redistribute wealth from the haves to have-nots, are heartless. I contend it's quite the opposite, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. The first Bible verse that comes to my mind about the matter is, and John the Baptist answered them, whoever has 2 tunics is to share with him who has none, and whoever has food is to do likewise. Luke 3:11. What I don't see in the Bible is a verse that goes like this. Whoever has 2 tunics is to give one to Caesar's minions, who tear away 60% of the fabric to give to their wives for sewing projects, and maybe get around to giving the tattered remains to him who has none. And whoever has food is to do likewise. Hashtag social justice Luke 3:11. I approve of every penny spent when I give my own time, money, and resources to help someone else. So do other Christians who give offerings and volunteer their time, church, and who donate their time and money themselves or through private charities. One nice thing about voluntary giving is that you can change how you volunteer over time in order to best suit the needs of others you see in your own community far better than any central planner ever could. For more on this, see the use of knowledge in society. Most, if not all, decisions we and politicians make are limited by natural laws. Just like you can't walk off a cliff without paying the consequences because of the natural law of gravity. You can't interfere with free market economics without paying the consequences because of the law of supply and demand, which is based on human nature. Any law that requires the change of human nature eventually manifests itself as cruel. Refer to the gulags of well-executed socialism. In Siberia, under policies that sounded wonderful, but failed to take into account human nature, people starved to death and died of exposure to sub-zero temperatures in gulags. I also wrote another answer to the question, what are the main issues you see with the free market economy and how would you solve them? Additionally, politicians who write laws to set price ceilings for rent control, and wage floors, minimum wage, often perpetuate and exacerbate the problems they purport to solve. Indeed, taking a look at the basic microeconomic principles at play show that instead of fixing the problem, they cause housing shortages and decrease the quality of current and future housing, as well as increase unemployment. And this all by people who say they care. So we take a little look at this rent control graph. We have the supply curve, and we have the demand curve. The point where the supply and demand curves intersect is the point where the quantity of houses of a two-bedroom apartment supply is equal to the quantity demanded. How badly people want something is exactly balanced out by how many of something there is. And price gets established at a particular level. Having a lower price causes there to be more demand for something than there is supply, due to how feasible it is to make things. Unfortunately, for people that think that demand is everything, well, demand isn't everything. In a free market, demand is wonderful. But ultimately, on the supply side, you can't do, some things are just impossible to do. And so there winds up being a shortage whenever you go and say, okay, we'll make it so that people can't pay too much. I'll legislate for the poor, and in legislating for the poor, actually fewer of them wind up being in housing. And then fewer of them would ever downsize from a 2-bedroom apartment to a 1 even if they needed to, due to the fact that they would be paying an artificially low price. So it's bad for everyone. And then going and saying, well, okay, well, we care about you. We're not going to make you work for a pittance. We're going to set a minimum wage. Well, then you wind up having a greater supply of workers than the demand for their work will ever be. Then you wind up having a surplus of workers that would be willing to work for less if the market would allow them to. But the market doesn't allow them to because somebody's gone and said you need to work for more. This effectively prices people out of entry-level jobs, and therefore prevents people from getting experience, and preventing them from getting experience prevents them from being able to move up in the chain, and so on. So whenever they say, oh, we care for you, we're going to raise the minimum wage, it's like, well, no. We care for you, therefore we're going to let there be a free market for your job. We're going to let there be a free market, and you can go and you can find in the market, in the free marketplace, a job that fits your situation. And if a low-wage job fits your situation, we're not going to stop you from getting it. We're not going to stop you from getting it. And these are graphs from the book that we've been going through. If we want to do good with the votes we cast and the decisions we make, we should seek to understand both the short and long-term impact of our decisions. Jesus himself said, "For which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it?" Luke 14:28. Jesus would have us be wise stewards of our resources. How do we do that? When therefore a man absorbed in the effect which is seen has not yet learned to discern those which are not seen, he gives way to fatal habits, not only by inclination but by calculation. This explains the fatally grievous condition of mankind. Ignorance surrounds its cradle. Then its actions are determined by their first consequences, the only ones which in its first stage it can see. It is only in the long run that it learns to take account of the others. It has to learn this lesson from two very different masters, experience and foresight. Experience teaches effectually but brutally, and makes us acquainted with all the effects of an action, by causing us to feel them. And we cannot fail to finish by knowing that fire burns, if we have burned ourselves. For this rough teacher I should like, if possible, to substitute a more gentle one. I mean foresight. For this purpose I shall examine the consequences of certain economical phenomena, by placing in opposition to each other those which are seen and those which are not seen. Frederick Bastiat. So this whole idea of having open borders, this whole idea of just letting free exchange of everything go, I like. But as long as there's a welfare state, you can't do that. You just can't do that. As long as there is an understanding that supply and demand will not meet, you can't do that. There's an order that things need to be fixed. And before we can open the borders, we need to abolish the welfare state. And some people might say, well, abolishing the welfare state is cruel. I say, no. Abolishing the welfare state is not cruel. Abolishing the welfare state is the most caring thing that we can do for anybody. It's the most caring thing we can do for anybody, especially considering that the dredges of society, the lowest point of society in the United States at least, is living at a higher standard of living than even the highest a century and a half ago. People say, oh, well, the problem is the distance between the rich and the poor. Well, I guess there's an argument to be made that people are discontent when there's a big enough inequality of wealth, and I can understand where that argument comes from. But still, I would say that at other points in history where morals were different, there was another word for this, and that word was envy. The word was envy. And people being envious of one another. I mean, if I'm envious of somebody else, I would be contemptuous of myself. I would treat myself with contempt because of my own envy. And I would treat you with contempt because of your envy, and you would treat me with contempt because of my envy. Envy was viewed as contemptuous rather than as a good thing. It was viewed as a personal problem that we would need to struggle with. Viewed as a personal problem that we would need to overcome. Gratitude is of incredible importance. I'm not going to say you force people to be grateful. You can't put a gun to somebody's head and force them to be grateful. I suppose you could, but that's not going to do anybody any good. But making a point of saying what you're thankful for before bed every night and saying what you're thankful every morning after you get up can certainly be a good thing. Gratitude is very important. And with it, many problems associated with inequality of wealth would be solved. I don't need to begrudge my neighbor a new car. I don't need to begrudge my neighbor's new house. I don't need to begrudge my neighbor's new anything. I don't need to begrudge my neighbor's wealth. I don't need to begrudge the fact that they might have 10 or 100 or 1,000 times bigger net worth than I have. I don't need to begrudge them. I just need to focus on producing value of my own and going for what I want. We'll continue this subject after a brief intermission of 8 minutes. Right, well, let's see if that worked. Now we're back. Some other thoughts to share. Yes, people have the right to be envious. And no, that's not necessarily a good thing. And one of the big differences that I would say that I have with what is generally found in Scandinavia, for instance, is the idea that it's the job of the government to curb people's envy. It's the job of the government to curb people's envy. I don't believe that. I don't agree with that. In Scandinavian countries, government has taken it upon itself to eliminate a great deal of wealth inequality. And I guess you could go and say, okay, there's a large administrative state. There's a large administrative state, and the general point of the whole matter is that in this large administrative state, one tries to balance, having the milk-producing cow of capitalism, and having the government milk it to make sure that and distribute the milk appropriately. Whereas communism would immediately kill the cow. The government, tries to apportion what the cow provides in what is determined in an equitable manner, and to some extent it works due to the fact that everybody seems to think that it's their obligation to society to pay their taxes and so on. Well, having this being people's obligation to society and having the taxes being a thing is, I suppose, we can say all well and good, even though I don't really think that is well or good. But we'll say it's all well and good for the sake of argumentation. And say, well, what happens if someone decides they don't like it? Well, I suppose they can leave. And what happens when many of the best and the brightest do leave, or have their assets somewhere else? What happens when the best and the brightest leave? What happens when you scare away the people that are producing to the point where the quality of production in general is lower than it could be at other places if it weren't so stifled? Right? People go and they look at the pies that exist and how to distribute the pies, or the milk cows that exist and how to distribute the milk. People look at all those different things, but then don't look at what could be. What could be involves imagination. And what could be can be scary. Furthermore, looking at what could be and having people individually looking at what could be, as opposed to governments looking at what could be and figuring out how to stay in office and how to maintain control over a populace, is dangerous for those in charge. And so a limited amount of imagination is encouraged, and people are led to believe that they're happy and free, and they're told that they're happy and free their whole lives, and so they believe it. And so they believe it. With the idea that somehow the whole analogy of the cow is wrong, right? That's a bad metaphor. It's a very, very bad metaphor. Because the fact of the matter is, in that particular metaphor, you would have to say that the well-being of the cow is adversely impacted by the differences in price signals from what they would be in a free market. And therefore, the effective productivity of society and the effective wealth of all the people in any given country will go down. And so everyone has to take a hit to their standard of living in order to maintain wealth inequality within tolerable means, or within acceptable tolerances, which is interesting because ultimately the hyper-rich find ways of circumventing the rules anyway. It's always been the case. In fact, progressive taxation and so on always has some sort of caveats or loopholes for the people in power, so that they can go and do their wealth acquisition with impunity. And of course leaves the system open for exploitation by other people that keep track of what the rules are. Right? So that just makes upward mobility in society all the more difficult. So the real purpose, I mean, if we go and we look at the people that are affected thereby, the real purpose of all the extra regulations isn't so much that they care about the people, it's that the people care about their own status and don't want to have competition that would bring up the standard of living of everyone, but would lower, or rather would increase the amount of innovation and effort that they need to put forward themselves. So having a great administrative state who's responsible for making sure everything happens right. I mean, for instance, my landlord was having a bunch of work done here on the place, and in order to have work done on the place, everything needed to be inspected. You know, things that in the States a landlord could just go and do himself. Things that a landlord could go and do himself were, you can't do that here. And so easy projects wind up becoming prohibitively expensive due to the fact that they need to be done to certain exacting tolerances put forth by the government. Of course, when things wind up getting really, really bad, or when things wind up getting really, really expensive, I mean, you wind up having, okay, what's the horse and what's the cart? Do we want to put the horse in front of the cart? No, but that increases the expense of all the different things that could possibly go on. The increased regulation, being a member of the EU, for instance, all that sort of a thing makes production all the more difficult. Simultaneously, we wind up having negative Euribor interest rates. Negative interest rates. So, if the incentive is to loan and give out money out the wazoo for the purpose of stimulating the economy, well, that sends artificial price signals because there's more money in the system than actually reflects the value being produced. And if there's more money in the system than reflects the value being produced, then people are buying things that they can't afford with money that they don't actually have. And eventually, when the piper needs to be paid, that results in economic collapse. I'm sorry, but the negative interest rates just do not work. Centrally determined negative interest rates do not work. The only thing that does is keep people moving for longer and delay the inevitable. So you have that combined with increased regulation leads to a facade of things being done. But if you think about things in terms of real wealth, in terms of what is actually valuable to me, the cost of living here is much, much higher than in the Midwest and the United States. Or conversely, you could say that at the same cost of living, the quality is much lower here than in the Midwest United States. But those are things that people don't bring up. because people go and see themselves as happy because they don't have any more than their neighbor, and they're not constantly comparing themselves to other people. Or rather, when they are constantly comparing themselves to other people, it's not like they're surrounded by a dearth of wealth in one place and then a lot less in another place, and getting a chance to see the stark contrast all the time. This is just psychological games, this whole people in Scandinavia are happier. Psychological games. That, and the fact that the United States foots the bill for much of the U.S. foreign policy is well, let's just put it this way: the United States is like the uncle that goes and spends for all the nieces and nephews, and allows the nieces and nephews to have a very, very good life, and winds up being hated due to interventionist policies. Which I mean, I don't like interventionism personally. I think that it's stupid. I think it's absolutely stupid. But then I think that once again, providing free military services for regulating commerce around the world and making sure that the bad things don't happen. And I would say that obviously even the U.S. military budget would be way higher than it is way higher than it actually needs to be. That's a different conversation. I'm just saying that people in Scandinavia, people in all these other different things benefit ultimately from an awful lot of the spending that the U.S. does so that they don't have to. And so they can have artificially higher amounts of money going to welfare programs than they would be able to have if they needed to have a bigger military, for instance. So anyhow, looking at all these different factors and thinking about them from the context of liberty, and viewing everything as a balancing act, I mean, you wind up having to have a particular system of values by which you judge if something is good or not. I mean, it can be, how are my feelings taken care of, right? That can be one particular set of values. Like, okay, well, I feel good about this, therefore this is good. But I think that that's not necessarily the strongest argument, due to the fact that feelings are transient. I mean, I can go and kidnap you and put you in my basement, and I can shoot you up with something, right? I can shoot you up with something. And then you can have good feelings. So feelings isn't necessarily a good grounds for determining morality. Well, then consensus can be, well, you can manipulate the masses. I mean, Edward Bernays showed in his book Propaganda quite conclusively that people can be manipulated. So, okay, well, there that goes. So there's obviously going to have to be some sort of objective moral standards. And, well, in the United States, you wound up basically having it being predicated upon a Judeo-Christian set of values, Lockean ideals, and so on. Classical liberalism, and it worked. It worked really, really well. So if you wind up having a whole bunch of dead weight sitting on top of the machinery of capitalism, if you have a whole bunch of dead weight sitting on top of that, eventually the dead weight's going to keep on getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and sucking more and more and more and more until an entire house of cards comes crashing down. And anybody who has an idea otherwise is sorely burying his head in the sand when it comes to taking a look at human nature. Milking the capitalist cow does not work in the long term. And by long term, I'm meaning long term. But so many people are wrapped up in the short term that they fail to see it. There's a great deal of hubris. People think that government can control way more than it actually can. I mean, if you do leave things up to the free market, then you wind up having a whole bunch more happy people. And if people have a gripe with things in the United States, I would say an awful lot of that has more to do with what they view as consequences of freedom, which are really the consequences of government overreach. It's very easy to point a finger and say capitalism is the problem, when the problem is actually crony capitalism as opposed to free market capitalism. Healthcare costs are through the roof in the United States, not because capitalism is bad, but because crony capitalism is bad. Veterans are not taken care of not because capitalism is bad, but because socialism is bad. And you're not going to find many politicians at all that will advocate for the cutting of government spending. The only way these sorts of austerity measures are ever taken is in the most dire of circumstances, and even in the most dire of circumstances, people still find a way of making the government bigger. And that pushes and pushes and pushes and pushes the day of economic reckoning further and further and further forward. But because so many people fail to understand economic policy and think instead with their feelings rather than with their brains, I lament for the economic fate of the Western world. I lament for the economic fate of the Western world. Many people said, okay, well, the 2008 financial crisis was it. That was our Great Recession. To which I will say, you ain't seen nothing yet. I'm going to go counter the narrative. I'm going to go counter the narrative that says that things are going better and say that things are going to have to get a lot worse before they get any better. And I don't have the wisdom to know how it all will play out, because I don't have the information. But I will make this suggestion to everyone. Produce more than you consume. And don't rely on the production of anybody else, except insofar as you trade with them to receive something commensurate in value. Do not rely on anything that is not predicated upon either production or mutual consensual exchange. Now, we'll be able to move on to bigger and better things. It's assuming I can actually find the link that I was looking for. Ah, yes, the underground history of American education. What in the world is wrong with me? I can't seem to find anything today. Alright, so we've gotten through part of chapter 1 of the underground history of American education. Punishments, okay, there's punishments of old schools, Hellenian schools, fresco at Herculaneum. Getting close. Okay, there's 7 liberal arts. Okay, here we go. The counterattack on democracy. By oh dear. There we go. No indigenous tradition beyond a general spirit of exuberant optimism. A belief the land had been touched by destiny, a conviction Americans could accomplish anything. John Jay wrote to Jefferson in 1787, "The enterprise of our country is inconceivable. Inconceivable, that is, to the British, Germans, and French, who were accustomed to keeping the common population on a leash. Our colonial government was the creation of the Crown, of course, but soon a fantastic idea began to circulate. A belief that people might create or destroy governments at their will. The empty slate of the new republic made it vulnerable to advanced utopian thinking. While in England and Germany temptation was great to develop and use Oriental social machinery to bend mass population into an instrument of elite will, in America there was no hereditary order or traditional direction. We were a nation awash in literate, self-reliant men and women, the vast majority with an independent livelihood or ambitions toward getting one. Americans were inventors and technicians without precedent, entrepreneurs unlocked from traditional controls, dreamers, confidence men, flim-flam artists. There was never a social stew quite like it. The practical difficulties these circumstances posed to utopian governing would have been insuperable except for one seemingly strange source of enthusiasm for such an endeavor in the business community. That puzzle can be solved by considering how the promise of democracy was a frightening terra incognita to men of substance. To look to men like Sam Adams or Tom Paine as directors of the future was like looking down the barrel of a loaded gun, at least to people of means, so the men who had begun the revolution were eased out by the men who ended it. As early as 1784, a concerted effort was made by the Boston business community to overthrow town meetings, replacing them with a professionally managed corporation. Joseph Barrell, a wealthy merchant, claimed that citizen safety could be enhanced this way, and besides, a great number of very respectable gentlemen wished it. Timothy Dwight, longtime president of Yale after 1795 and a pioneer in modern education, advocating science as the center of curriculum, fought a mighty battle against advancing democracy. Democracy was hardly the sort of experiment men of affairs would willingly submit their lives and fortunes to for very long. This tension explains much about how our romance with forced schooling came about. It was a way to stop democracy aborting as Germany had done. Much ingenuity was expended on this problem in the early republic, particularly by so-called liberal Christian sects like Unitarians and Universalists. If you read relics of their debates preserved from select lyceums, private meetings at which minutes were kept, journals, recollections of drawing room conversations, and club discussions, you see that what was shaping up was an attempt to square the circle, to give the appearance that the new society was true to its founding promise, while at the same time a sound basis could be established for the meritorious to run things. Once again, the spirit of Sparta was alive with its ephors and its reliance on forced instruction. In discussions, speeches, sermons, editorials, experimental legislation, letters, diaries, and elsewhere, the ancient idea of massed forced schooling was called forth and mused upon. By the end of the first quarter of the 19th century, a form of school technology was up and running in America's larger cities, one in which children of lower class customers were psychologically conditioned to obedience under pretext that they were learning reading and counting, which may also have happened. These were the Lancaster schools, sponsored by Governor DeWitt Clinton of New York and prominent Quakers like Thomas Eddy, builder of the Erie Canal. They soon spread to every corner of the nation where the problem of an incipient proletariat existed. Lancaster schools are cousins of today's school factories. What few knew then or realize now is that they were also a Hindu invention designed with the express purpose of retarding intellectual development. How Hindu schooling came to America, England, Germany, and France at just about the same time is a story which has never been told. A full treatment is beyond the scope of this book, but I'll tell you enough to set you wondering how an Asiatic device specifically intended to preserve a caste system came to reproduce itself in the early republic, protected by influentials of the magnitude of Clinton and Eddy. Even a brief dusting off of schooling's Hindu provenance should warn you that what you know about American schooling isn't much. First, a quick gloss on the historical position of India at the time of the American Revolution, for Lancaster schools were in New York 2 decades after its end. India fell victim to Western dominance through nautical technology in the following fashion. When medieval Europe broke up after its long struggle to reconcile emergent science with religion, 5 great ocean powers appeared to compete for the wealth of the planet: Portugal, Spain, France, the Netherlands, and England. Portugal was the first to sail for treasure, leaving colonies in India, China, and South America, but its day in the sun was short. Spain emerged as the next global superpower, but after 1600 her character decayed rapidly from the corrupting effects of the gold of the Americas, which triggered a long national decline. The Netherlands' turn followed because that nation had the advantage of a single-minded commercial class in control of things with one aim in mind: wealth. The Dutch monopolized the carrying trade of Europe with globe-trotting merchant ships and courageous military seamanship. Yet, as with Portugal before it, the Dutch population was too small, its internal resources too anemic for its dominance to extend very long. Beginning in the 17th century, England and France gradually built business in the East, both balked for a time by the Dutch, who controlled the spice trade of the Indies. 3 naval wars with the Dutch made the Royal Navy master of the seas, in the process developing tactics of sea warfare that made it dominant for the next 2 centuries. By 1700, only France and England remained as global sea powers with impressive fighting capability, and during the last half of that century these giants slugged it out directly in Canada, India, and in the territory which is today the United States, with the result that France went permanently into eclipse. In India, the two contended through their commercial pseudopodia. The British and French East India Companies each maintained a private army to war on the other for tea, indigo, turmeric, ginger, quinine, oilseeds, silk, and that product which most captivated British merchants with its portability and breakaway profit potential: opium. At Plassey, Shadurnagar, Madras, and Vandevash, this long corporate rivalry ended. The French abandoned India to the British. The drug monopoly was finally England's. Out of this experience and the observations of a wealthy young Anglican chaplain in India, the formula for modern schooling was discovered. Perhaps it was no more than coincidence this fellow held his first gainful employment as a schoolteacher in the United States. On the other hand, perhaps his experience in a nation which successfully threw off British shackles sensitized him to the danger an educated populace poses to plutocracies. Education. I'm, well, just a little confused. I'm just a little confused. Education. I'm just a little confused. Because it seems to me that, I can understand why schools don't want to teach. And I can understand why people prefer distraction. But I think it's so amazing how something so small can be so powerful. No, it's like, have you ever watched the Mr. Plinkett reviews of the Star Wars series? I know this may seem a little silly, but I would highly recommend taking a look at that if you haven't. There was one particular scene that I believe it was either involving the first or the second Star Wars episode, like Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, or Star Wars Episode 2, the Clone Wars or Attack of the Clones, or whatever that one was. He said the purpose of one of these scenes, was, or the purpose of all the CGI, was to cram as much crap as could possibly be crammed into any given scene. In other words, people are craving crap in the scenes. People are craving constant stimulation. People are learning to be constantly stimulated. And if something isn't stimulating on a particular level, a lot of people just won't go to it at all. People can't stand the idea of sitting quietly and pondering something. People can't stand the idea of not having their day filled from dawn to dusk and beyond with constant stimulation, with being constantly fed something, constantly consuming stimulation. And not producing anything of their own. Tell me how many people actually know how to play an instrument. How many people make their own music? How many people write their own stories? How many people tell their own stories? How many people do anything of consequence? Most people nowadays are consuming. And it's that focus on consumption that causes problems. It's that focus on consumption that causes problems. And due to the fact that there is the gigantic focus on consumption, people are easily manipulated into saying, well, as long as I have my bread and circuses, everything will be fine. And unfortunately, bread and circuses happen to be what happens on the tail end of societies, tail end of cultures, the tail end of countries. So have I given up on Western civilization? No. But I think that people will need to be woken up from their slumber. And I think that many are already getting to be woken up. Many have already realized that the mainstream media is a propaganda machine that thrives on producing sensational material as opposed to factual, no spin content that picks what to report on based on how many views they think that they'll be getting. I mean, I suppose you can expect that, but then who's is the problem, really? Whose is the problem? The problem is those that watch the crap and create a demand for it. If nobody's watching something, the advertising revenue will go down. If the advertising revenue will go down, people will do something else in order to try to get the advertising revenue to go up. I mean, streaming on other platforms has become much more popular recently. And you wind up having all these different niche personalities that wind up getting comparable or sometimes much greater viewership than the big media companies that took over the second half of the 20th century in terms of exposition of ideas. I mean, cable TV is on its way out, if not all the way out. I mean, when living by myself, I've never had a TV. And I know many people that have never had TVs. Of course, they do have computers, and they do remain reasonably well informed about the world, but that's because they can go and search for their own information and find it. They're not... Of course, there are also these things called papers and magazines and things of that nature that can be read. And there are all these sorts of independent news outlets that can provide wonderful stuff. I mean, the marketplace for information is so huge. And people are beginning to realize the extent of it, and people are beginning to realize how unreliable the mainstream media is in comparison to going and doing your own diligence. And of course it takes extra time and effort. But it's something that people are starting to be more and more willing to do. I'm hoping that people start becoming more and more willing to understand economics. I'm hoping that people will start being more and more willing to figure out the most effective ways of living their lives. Good information will definitely help that. Good information will definitely help that. Now, as we continue here, regulation by market forces. It's about 13 minutes until the hour. And there's a lot to be said for regulation by market forces. And I understand that this whole thing is kind of disjointedly gone from topic to topic, but the fact of the matter is that let's try that, see if that's any better. No wonder it was using so much CPU. I wound up having, there we are. The effort of merely... Economics is a term for this kind of effort to influence government intervention in the economy for one special benefit. Rent-seeking. Rent, in the sense of the word, is income derived from possession of a special privilege. The effort of merely seeking those privileges instead of producing valuable goods or services is wasteful. Worse is the economic distortion caused by the privileges themselves. This is not to say that there should be no regulation of the quality and safety of goods and services, not at all. Rather, it is to say that regulation by market forces works better than government regulation. And the freer a market is from governmental restrictions, the stronger will be the competitive forces that regulate it. To regulate is to make regular and orderly, to hold to a standard, to control according to rule, as a thermostat regulates the temperature in a building. Market forces regulate continuously as competing businesses offer what they hope will be good value. Customers choose among the various offerings, competing businesses react to those customer choices, and then customers choose again. That process is the market's regulator, whereas government regulation works by the restriction of choice, restriction that is often captured by special interests. Regulation by market forces relies on the exercise of choice. Suppose there were no hairdresser licensing. Suppose state legislatures repealed or sunsetted their hairdresser licensing laws, relying thereafter only on freedom of exchange and regulation by market forces. What would happen? In a true free market for hairdressing, what forces would pressure hairdressers toward safety and quality? How do people choose their hairdressers now in the presence of licensing? How many base their choices on their hairdresser's license? Probably very few. Most of us rely primarily on experience. We try a hairdresser or barber, and if we like the results, we go back. If not, we go elsewhere. Hairdressers' need for repeat business, along with customers' freedom to go elsewhere, is enough by itself to enforce pretty high standards of quality. Thus, the most important regulator in the market is competition itself, which subjects every business to the continuous judgment of the consuming public, who are free at every moment to give their business to a competitor. Note that meaningful competition depends on freedom of sellers to enter into a business, if they can find a willing buyer, and on freedom of buyers to take their business where they will. Government licensing reduces competition by excluding many who would be able to find willing buyers, as it excluded Charissa. Market discipline grows stronger as freedom of exchange is expanded. Working together with customer experience are reputation and word of mouth, which give customers the benefit of experiences others have had with a particular hairdresser. Salons and salon franchises such as the Hair Cuttery work hard to establish and maintain a good reputation by giving good service. Suppose a customer is injured while getting a haircut. In such cases, rare, we would hope and expect, the customer can sue for damages. Holding people accountable for the injury they do to another's property or person is a foundational legal institution on which a free market is based. Salons themselves have a strong financial incentive to make sure injury never occurs, of course. Accordingly, they are likely to require some assurance of quality and competence before hiring. They might get that by observing the work of apprentices or by giving their own tests to applicants. More commonly, many salons might require some third-party certification of the hairdressers they hire, such as a diploma from a reputable beauty school. Such private sector certification is fundamentally different from government licensing. It is voluntary rather than mandatory, so that if the certifier's requirements are excessive or inappropriate, the stylists and salons can turn elsewhere or do without. It is thus competitive rather than monopolized. Stylists and salons may choose from a variety of certifiers with different approaches and standards, rather than being forced to use the monopoly government licensing board. This competition tends to weed out requirements that don't actually benefit customers at acceptable cost, and because it's competitive, voluntary certification cannot be captured by a special interest group. Another kind of enterprise with a financial stake in safety and quality is insurance companies. The more competently and safely their clients work, the lower will be the payments insurance companies have to make to insure injured parties. Therefore, the insurers of hairdressers also have an incentive to require reasonable standards of hairdresser competence and training as a condition of providing insurance against lawsuit judgments. In sum, in a totally free market for hairdressing, market forces would effectively regulate the quality and competence of hairdressers without being captured by existing hairdressers who use it to exclude competitors such as Sharissa and raise the prices their customers must pay. Notice that all the market forces just mentioned are regulating hairdressing now, alongside the state government's licensing requirements. Which of the two kinds of regulation do you suppose is more effective in ensuring the public health and safety, not to mention decent haircuts? In a free market, these kinds of market forces would regulate the provision of virtually every good and service. Like other aspects of the free market, they wouldn't work perfectly because human beings are imperfect, but they would work, well, much better than the top-down restrictions imposed by governments. For readers who want to explore this subject further, I recommend Milton Friedman's discussion of licensing physicians in Who Protects the Consumer, Chapter 7 of Free to Choose. New York, Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, 1980, and Dan Klein and Alex Tabarrok's discussion of pharmaceuticals regulation on the FDAreview.org website, http://www.fdareview.org. And this works because people are self-interested in public as in private life. And the free market is the only, absolutely the only, thing that I've seen, certainly the best thing that I've seen, to provide value for people. Freedom is choice. And free people will, free people will always accomplish more and have better lives than slaves. Now that is an a priori position I have. That is an a priori position I have. And with that said, due to the fact that I haven't had anyone to interact with for quite some time, I am going to close the stream now that it's been 2 hours. And I'm going to wish all of you a very happy Independence Day. If I may make a suggestion, that you and your families take some time today, in between all the celebrating that you do, today, tomorrow, whenever you see this, in between all the celebrating that you do, to read some Locke. Read some history. Think about the founding of the country we love so very much. Think about the principles upon which it was founded. Think about the immutability of human rights. I wish you a very, very happy Independence Day. And I will be streaming. I'll be having a 4th of July stream again tomorrow. And I hope that it will find you all well. Thank you. Bye.